The theme of this Rakdos deck revolves around Magar of the Magic Strings' activated ability. There is a swath of powerful instant and sorcery cards in this build. Also present are numerous rummage spells, which allow us to discard these instant and sorcery cards into our graveyard, which then serve as targets for Magar's activated ability. As an additional graveyard filling avenue, there are spells and effects in the 99 that let us search our library for more instant and sorcery cards to be put directly into the graveyard. In order for our Magar created creatures to deal combat damage to our opponents with relative ease, other cards are included that provide different forms of evasion. This dynamic allows our creatures to deal combat damage to our opponents easily, which triggers their Magar gifted abilities and creates copies of the cards themselves for us to cast without paying their mana costs. Through this optimized engine, we will control the battlefield and overwhelm our opponents on the path to victory.
Hello and welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. Magar of the Magic Strings is a 3/3 legendary Minotaur performer for 1 in Rakdos colors. For the same mana value, we can activate Magar's ability and note the name of target instant or sorcery card in our graveyard and put it onto the battlefield face down. It's a 3/3 creature with, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we may create a copy of the card with the noted name. We may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. And if this creature were to leave the battlefield, we exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. The following deck tech is going to showcase a powerful suite of instant and sorcery spells that synergize with Magar, as well as ways in which to get them into the graveyard. The following cards are instants and sorceries that we want to target with Magar's activated ability straight from the graveyard. And the first is Soul Shatter. At instant speed, it's a 2 and a black, and each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest converted mana cost among creatures and planeswalkers they control. In our graveyard, we can target this card with Magar's ability, and when that creature deals combat damage to a player, we will be able to cast Soul Shatter without paying its mana cost. Next up, we have Make an Example. At sorcery speed, it's 3 and a black. Each opponent separates the creatures they control into 2 piles. For each opponent, we choose one of the piles, and each opponent sacrifices the creatures in their chosen pile. Of course, piles could be empty. That would make it very easy for us to pick all of the creatures that our opponents put into the other pile. And again, these are instants and sorceries, but they will all be cast during combat with Magar's ability. Next, we have Siphon Mind, 3 and a black at sorcery speed. Each other player discards a card from their hand. We draw a card for each card discarded this way. In a traditional game of EDH, if we're sitting at the table with 3 opponents, and one of our Magar created creatures is Siphon Mind and it hits with combat damage, each of those opponents will discard a card, and we will draw 3 cards off of that spell. For 4 black mana, we have Temporal Extortion. Sorcery speed, when we play Temporal Extortion, any player may pay half their life rounded up, and if a player does, this spell gets countered. We take an extra turn after this one. With enough life lost by our opponents, it may be only a matter of time until they succumb to a creature that continues to give us extra turns in the form of a Magar-activated Temporal Extortion. For the purposes of game-ending spells, Savage Beating provides that with a Magar activation. 3 and 2 red at instant speed with the Entwine mechanic of 1 and a red, we can only play Savage Beating on our turn and only during combat. We get to pick one. creatures we control gain double strike until end of turn, or we untap all creatures we control, and after this phase, there is an additional combat phase. So if we were able to activate Magar's ability targeting Savage Beating from our graveyard, it comes into play face down as a 3/3 creature. If we are able to deal combat damage to an opponent, then we can cast Savage Beating for its Entwine cost, without paying the mana cost, of course, and we can have creatures we control get double strike, and we can also have creatures get additional combat phases. Savage Beating is a win condition in this deck because it has an infinite loop where we can continue casting the spell, getting more and more combat phases. And as you'll see further on in this deck tech, we have numerous ways to make our creatures unblockable, so that if one of them happened to be the Savage Beating, we would be able to clear out the table without any opponent interaction. Our next spell is Invoke Despair. Sorcery speed 1 and 4 black, but from the graveyard it's just going to cost one of Magar's activated abilities, which is 1 in Rakdos colors. Target opponent will sacrifice a creature, and if they can't, they lose 2 life and we draw a card. We repeat this process for an enchantment and a planeswalker. So the ceiling on this card will be they lose 6 life and we draw 3 cards, or they sacrifice 3 permanents. Either way, having Invoke Despair as one of our 3/3 Magar created creatures could cause a lot of havoc at the EDH table. Next spell is All is Dust. It's a tribal sorcery for Eldrazi, and it's 7 generic mana. Each player sacrifices all colored permanents they control. It's important to note here that the 3/3 face-down creatures created by Magar are colorless, and we do not need Magar on our side of the battlefield in order for the abilities to trigger. They are imprinted on the card when they are activated by Magar's ability. So even if we were to cast an All is Dust and lose our general, our 3/3 creatures, which one of them could be an All is Dust, remain on the battlefield, and each time it hits for combat damage, every player is going to sacrifice any non-land permanent every player is going to sacrifice a colored permanent that they control. That pretty much could wipe out the board every single time we connect with combat damage, and without any opponent interaction from that creature, it's only a matter of time until we win the game. Next spell is Brass's Bounty. Sorcery for 6 and a red. For each land we control, we will create a treasure token. All we have to do is hit with combat damage, and we're going to accelerate our mana in a way that should put us right past our opponents, and they should not be able to catch up. Next spell is Cabal Conditioning. Now, this is a sorcery back from the time of Lorwyn. 6 and a black, and any number of target players each discard cards from their hand equal to the highest converted mana cost among permanents we control. So we will need another permanent on our side of the battlefield because our 3/3 face-down creatures are 0 for the mana cost. So as long as there's any other non-land permanent that we can have on our side of the battlefield that will have a mana cost, hitting combat damage with Cabal Conditioning will empty our opponent's hands as quickly as we can send that damage. Next spell is Grave Endurance, 5 and 2 black. This is at instant speed, but again with Magar, it's completely different. We will roll 2 d10, that's 2 10-sided dice, and choose one result. We return a creature card from our graveyards to the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to that result. Then each opponent loses X life, and we gain X life, where X is the other result. This deck is not inundated with creatures. We have many instants and sorcery spells because we want Magar to target as many of those cards as possible. We do have some niche creatures that we'll introduce later on in this deck tech, but for the purposes of Grave Endeavor, we will most likely be using the Life Drain ability much more than the returning the creature card from our graveyards to the battlefield ability. I will say this has a fantastic synergy if Magar is in our graveyard. If Magar is targeted for removal and it's going to die, we let it hit the graveyard, and then Grave Endeavor will be able to bring it back each time it hits for combat damage if we have it as a 3/3 face-down creature, and then we can put +1/+1 counters on it, and then the life drain is the ability that's going to help us win the game, but having Magar back from the graveyard is just the gravy on top of those mashed potatoes. Our next spell is Scour from Existence. This is just going to straight exile target permanent. And notice, we could exile lands with Scour from Existence. That could be a very, very powerful card if we get that down as a 3/3, particularly if we can send it in unblocked for combat damage. Next is Sorin's Vengeance. It's a sorcery 4 and 3 black. It deals 10 damage to target player, and we gain 10 life. That's a 20-point life swing on the back of a 3/3 creature. And if we can get that creature in for combat damage, then that player is going to have another 3 life if we are targeting that same player with the 10 damage from Sorin's Vengeance, which could total 13 damage just from one 3/3 creature. And on the backside, we gain 10 life. Next is Army of the Damned. It is a sorcery 5 and 3 black. We create 13 tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. If we can get this onto the battlefield as quickly as possible with Magar, we could overwhelm our opponents with a very zombified battlefield. And if we can't target it with Magar's ability, perhaps Magar is in the command zone languishing from too much commander tax, we can always flash it back for 7 and 3 black. Next sorcery is Fevered Suspicion, 6 and Rakdos colors. Each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card, and we may cast any number of spells from among those non-land cards without paying the mana costs. So this is going to allow us card advantage by utilizing the top of our opponent's libraries as extensions of our own hand, and we don't have to actually pay to cast those spells. The rebound on this card is just added gravy to this spell. So Fevered Suspicion we could consider to be one of our potential win conditions based upon what our opponents are playing and what's near the top of their libraries. Next sorcery we have is Worst Fears, 7 and 1 black mana. We control target player during that player's next turn. Can you imagine a scenario where it's 1v1 and we have a 3/3 Worst Fears down on our side of the battlefield and we are consistently able to hit that opponent for combat damage? That opponent will never have another turn, and it will only be a matter of time until we close out the game. Next, another sorcery, it's in Garruk's Wake. We'll destroy all creatures we don't control and all planeswalkers we don't control as well. This is going to help us to control the board, make sure that our Magar created 3/3s can swing in for combat damage, and be able to cast the copies of those spells in Garruk's Wake will help with that. And in Garruk's Wake version 1.0, we'll do the same thing, minus the Planeswalker removal. That will be Plague Wind from Prophecy. Destroy all creatures we don't control. They cannot be regenerated. Just another way to keep the path clear, so our 3/3s can come in and deal the damage that they need to do, so that we can cast these spells for free. Our next sorcery is Rise of the Dark Realms. With all of the removal we have showcased so far in this deck tech and many more pieces to come, having a mass recursion spell like Rise of the Dark Realms, where we get to put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under our control, that's just going to act as an additional win condition in a deck that's shaping up to have many, many. Next up is Curse of the Cabal, a sorcery for 9 and a black. Target player sacrifices half the permanents they control, rounded down. Can you imagine being able to swing in with this as a 3/3 unblockable creature and having opponent after opponent sacrificing half of the permanents they control? We are never going to suspend this card. We're going to have this in our graveyard, waiting to be turned into a 3/3 creature by an activation from Magar, our general. And the last card in this snippet of the video is Blood for the Blood God. It's an instant for 8, 2 black and a red. And in every instance throughout this deck, we will never pay that mana cost, because if it's in our hand, we'll be able to pay 1 less for it to cast for each creature that died this turn. So it's very, very possible that we can pay 2 black and a red mana as a way in which to cast this spell and get it into our graveyard. That's just one way we can get these spells into our graveyard, of course, because we're going to showcase many other ways as we move further into this deck tech. But what Blood for the Blood God does is we discard our hand, we draw 8 cards, and then this deals 8 damage to each opponent. With each opponent's starting life total being only 40, we will only need to have that 3/3 hit a few times in order for this to deal the damage we need to win the game, and we're constantly discarding our hand, putting more and more instant and sorcery spells into our graveyard, and refilling that hand by putting 8 cards into it each time that 3/3 connects with combat damage. The following cards are going to help us get our instant and sorcery spells into our graveyard. And we begin with Entomb. 1 black mana at instant speed. We search our library for any card and put that right into the graveyard. A great way to get one of the aforementioned big instant and sorcery spells from our library into our graveyard, waiting to be targeted by Magar. Next up, we have Unmarked Grave at sorcery speed. It's 1 and a black. We search our library for a non-legendary card. Good thing this is Rakdos Spellslinger, because we don't have to worry about that limitation. And we put that card into our graveyard. Costs us 1 more mana with what could be potential limitation, but it is not. And it's a little bit slower than Entomb, but it will get the job done. One of the few creatures we have included in the 99 of this deck is Auric Loremage. It's a 3/3 human warlock for 2 and 2 black. We can turn Auric Loremage sideways to search our library for a card and put it into the graveyard. Of course, we are going to put most likely an instant or sorcery spell. And if we do, we also get to put a +1/+1 counter on this human warlock. Next card up is Final Parting. 3 and 2 black mana at sorcery speed. We search our library for 2 cards, put 1 into our hand and the other into our graveyard. So at sorcery speed, this is kind of like an Entomb plus Demonic Tutor. The casting cost definitely is inflated for what we're looking to do, and this could be a good target for Magar as a 3/3 face-down creature, and each time it hits for combat damage, we just go, put another instant or sorcery spell into our hand, and then put another one into the graveyard. All right, next we have a host of looting spells to get through, and we're going to begin with Faithless Looting. Sorcery speed, 1 red mana, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, flash this back for 2 and 1 red mana. A great way to start filling up the graveyard, even on turn 1. Get those big instant and sorcery spells into the yard so that Magar has a feast when it enters our side of the battlefield. Instant speed, we have Cathartic Pyre, 1 and a red. We get to pick one of the following 2 modes. We can have it deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, which, let's face it, could be beneficial, but for the purposes of this deck and what we're trying to do with our general, we're most likely going to discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. We want the instants and sorcery spells in our graveyard so that Magar can turn them into 3/3s and then we can cast them for free when they strike for combat damage. Back to sorceries, it is Cathartic Reunion, 1 and a red. As an additional cost to cast a spell, we discard 2 cards, and then we get to draw 3. So we discard 2, draw 3. We're filling our yard with the cards we need for Magar to have quite the general feast. Back to instant, it's Faithless Salvaging, 1 and a red. We discard a card, we draw a card, but this spell has the rebound mechanic. So when we cast it from our hand, we exile it as it resolves, and at the beginning of our next upkeep, we may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. So we're going to invest 1 and a red to total, discard 2 cards, and then draw 2 cards over 2 different instant spells. Another instant is Thrill of Possibility. 1 in a red. As an additional cost, we discard a card, and then we draw 2 cards. So we're going to put into the graveyard one of the biggest, nastiest instant or sorcery cards we have, and then we're going to replace that with 2 more cards from the top of our library. Back to sorcery speed, we have Tormenting Voice, 1 in a red. As an additional cost to cast a spell, we discard a card, and then we draw 2 cards. So that's pretty much Thrill of Possibility, just at sorcery speed. Ticking up the mana value from 2 to 3, we go to Seize the Spoils. Sorcery speed for 2 in a red. As an additional cost to cast the spell, we discard a card. Here we draw 2 cards, but we create a treasure token. So this is Tormenting Voice. This is Tormenting Voice with an additional mana to cast, but we get that back at the end of the spell by having it replaced with a treasure token. Going from 3 to 4, we go to Big Score, an instant speed 3 and 1 red. As an additional cost to cast this spell, we discard yet another instant or sorcery spell. Of course, it doesn't have to be that, but Magar wants that to be. We get to draw 2 cards, and we create 2 treasure tokens. So this is, again, building upon Seize the Spoils. 1 more mana, but instead of getting 1 treasure token, we get 2. And next up is Pirate's Pillage, 3 and 1 red mana at sorcery speed. And as an additional cost to cast this, we're going to discard yet another card. We draw 2 cards and we create 2 treasure tokens. We're putting cards in the graveyard. We're putting cards into our hand. We're mana accelerating ahead of our opponents with the treasure tokens. We're doing everything we can to appease our general. And the last card for this section of the video, it is Unexpected Windfall, instant speed 2 and 2 red. And of course, as an additional cost to cast this spell, we'll discard a card, and then we'll draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens. So these are the cards that we are going to use to get instant and sorcery spells into our graveyard, so that when Magar hits our side of the battlefield, he has a host of different spells from which to choose. The following cards are going to help to make Magar's 3/3 face-down instant and sorcery spell creatures unblockable. The first is Thieves' Tools. It is an equipment for 1 and 1 black mana with an equip cost for 2 generic mana. When it ETBs, we create a treasure token, so we get back half the mana we invested in this spell in the form of some mana acceleration from a treasure token. Equipped creature cannot be blocked as long as its power is 3 or less. The creatures that Magar creates are 3/3s. So slapping on Thieves' Tools will make that creature unblockable as long as we have no peripheral Anthem effects. Next is Trailblazer's Boots, another equipment. It's 2 to cast and 2 to equip. An equipped creature has non-basic land walk. If there's one thing Commander players love, it's pimping out those land bases. How many times do you sit down at the table and a player is playing with nothing but basic lands? That is a feat that is as rare as winter roses, and by including a copy of Trailblazer's Boots on one of our by including the copy and then equipping it onto one of our 3/3 creatures, we can make them suffer for that indulgence. Another equipment is Whisper Silk Cloak. It's an equipment for 3 generic and 2 to equip. Equipped creature is unblockable, and equipped creature has Shroud. So outside of any kind of mass board wipe or mass disruption spell, whatever 3/3 creature has a Whisper Silk Cloak on it is going to get in for combat damage and be protected by the presence of Shroud. All right, next we have Key to the City. This is not an equipment, but it is an artifact for 2 generic mana. We can tap to discard a card, which helps to synergize with Magar by getting instant and sorcery cards into our graveyard. And in addition, up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn. So not only can we fill the graveyard by putting an instant or sorcery spell in it by tapping this card, but one of Magar's created 3/3s becomes unblockable until the end of turn. And then when we make back to our next turn, when this becomes untapped, we can pay 2 generic mana, and if we do, we get to draw a card. Key to the City does a lot in this deck for the purposes of synergizing with Magar. And next we have Douthie Embrace, an enchantment back from the days of Tempest. It's 2 and a black to cast, and we can pay 2 black mana to give target creature shadow until end of turn. A creature with shadow can only be blocked by other creatures with shadow, and creatures with shadow can't block creatures without it. How many times do you sit down to the EDH table and somebody's playing with shadow? This, honestly, may be the first time you've ever heard of that mechanic. Put this into our Magar deck, target our 3/3 face-down creatures with it, and give them shadow for the purposes of hitting our opponents with unblockable combat damage. What's better than having one of Magar's 3/3 face-down creatures trigger and create a copy of one of those powerful instant and sorcery cards? How about having it done twice? The following cards help us to double that trigger. The first is Twinferno, an instant for 1 and a red that lets us pick one of the following 2 modes. When we cast our next instant or sorcery spell this turn, we can copy that spell and we may choose new targets for the copy. So we can use Twinferno to copy one of the spells that is created by one of Magar's 3/3 face-down creatures. And if we don't want to do it that way, then we can choose a creature we control to have double strike until end of turn, which will provide that second copy. One way or another, Twinferno is going to give us 2, which is better than 1. Back to our equipment. Illusionist's Bracers for 2 generic mana and 3 to equip gives equipped creature whenever an ability that is activated, if it's not a mana ability, we get to copy that ability and choose new targets for the copy. If this is equipped to one of Magar's 3/3 face-down creatures, then we get to copy the ability that is created by creating an additional copy of that card. We get to cast both of them without paying their mana costs, and Illusionist Bracers will do that for the one-time equip cost of 3. Next, we have Strionic Resonator, an artifact for 2 generic mana and 2 generic mana to activate. We get to tap it, and we can copy target triggered ability we control and choose new targets for the copy. So what we will do is one of our 3/3s will strike for combat damage. We will pay 2 mana, tap Strionic Resonator, and copy the card that's going to be triggered, or copy the triggered card by creating a second copy of that card, and then we can cast both of them without paying their mana costs. And lastly, for this section of the video, we have Twinning Staff, an artifact for 3 generic mana. If we would copy a spell 1 or more times, instead copy it that many times plus an additional time. We may choose new targets for the additional copy. So we can cast Twinning Staff for its initial mana cost of 3, let it gather dust on the battlefield, and each time one of our Magar 3/3 instant or sorcery creatures strike for combat damage, the copy that's created will copy twice without doing anything else. No other resources needed. And if we decide to get inordinately greedy, we can pay 7 generic mana, tap Twinning Staff, and copy target instant or sorcery spell we control, and we may choose new targets for the copy. With enough mana available, it would be fantastic to do that. But for the purposes of this video and this deck tech, I see Twinning Staff acting more as just being on the battlefield, copying the cards that Magar's creatures will create when they strike for their combat damage. And these following miscellaneous spells will help us to optimize what we're trying to do with the 99 in conjunction with Magar and its activated ability. The first is Profane Tutor. I don't sense that we're really going to suspend this ever, because this is going to be one of those great and sneaky sorceries that we want in our graveyard, that if we can turn into a 3/3 creature with Magar's ability, who wouldn't want to cast Demonic Tutor every single turn for free, as long as we can strike an opponent for combat damage? Profane Tutor will allow us to do that every single time. Another miscellaneous spell which is going to be very, very good in this deck It will be Anger. Anger is a 2/2 incarnation with haste for 3 and 1 red mana, and if Anger is in our graveyard, which we have many, many ways to get it there, and we control a mountain, which we will have many, many mountains in this Rakdos deck, then creatures we control have haste. It will be very beneficial to have Anger in our graveyard and a mountain if we so choose to activate Magar's ability during our turn and then send those creatures into hasty combat. We could, in the absence of Anger, we could just wait until the end of our last opponent's turn to activate its ability, but we also leave Magar vulnerable to any potential removal going through a round of spells without getting any of his 3/3 face-down instant and sorcery creatures on our side of the battlefield. Anger lets us do that, and as long as it's in our graveyard with a mountain on our side of the battlefield, we can create those tokens on our turn and send them into combat immediately. Next card is Bone Miser, a sneaky addition here in a deck that's having us discard many, many cards. It's a zombie wizard that's 4/4 for 4 and a black mana, and whenever we discard a creature card, we'll create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. That is a feat that may be very rare in the 99 of this, because, let's face it, we don't have a lot of creatures in this deck. So more often than not, we're going to utilize its other 2 abilities much more frequently than the first. So whenever we discard a land, we add 2 black mana. Okay, that black mana will only be there during the phase that we discard the card, but it is still something that we can count on for mana acceleration. And lastly, and probably the most potent for our build, is whenever we discard a non-creature, non-land card, i.e. instant or sorcery spell, we get to draw a card. So with Bone Miser on our side of the battlefield and any of our host of looting spells in our hand, or perhaps face down as 3/3 creatures from Magar's activated ability, we're going to be discarding more and more instants and sorceries to our graveyard and drawing cards as a result. Next is Berserker's Onslaught, an enchantment for 3 and 2 red mana. Attacking creatures we control have double strike. How this synergizes with what we're trying to do in our deck is whenever one of Magar's 3/3 creatures deals combat damage to a player, we get to copy the card that it is. So if we can do that twice with the presence of double strike, then we get to create 2 copies. So Berserker's Onslaught is going to allow us to do that as long as it can strike for combat damage. And just as a side note, this gives attacking creatures we control double strike. This will not help on the defensive side because this is not going to give them double strike when our creatures are not attacking. All right, next we have Void Maw, a 4/5 trampling horror for 4 and 2 black mana, and if another creature we put into a graveyard from play, we exile it from the game instead. This doesn't really do too much from our vantage point, but it will help to nullify any of our opponents who might be participating in any graveyard shenanigans. More importantly for us, we may put a card removed from the game with Voidmaw into its owner's graveyard, and Voidmaw gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So how does this synergize with what we're doing with Magar? Well, if Magar is creating these 3/3 face-down instant and sorcery creatures that when they leave the battlefield, they become exiled instead, therefore we lose the instant or sorcery spell, Voidmaw, if it is on the battlefield, can let us put that card exiled by Voidmaw instead, as opposed to being exiled by what it says on Magar's card. How that is important is because then we can take the card that was exiled by Voidmaw and put it right back into our graveyard because we were exiling it with Voidmaw and not necessarily the imprint that was on the 3/3 creature from Magar's activated ability. So Voidmaw allows us to not lose our instant and sorcery creatures to the second effect that Magar places on it, and instead Voidmaw exiles those creatures, and then we can put them right back into our graveyard with Voidmaw's last ability. And lastly, for this section of the video, our last miscellaneous spell, it is Surge to Victory, a sorcery for 4 and 2 red. We exile target instant or sorcery card from our graveyard, and creatures we control get +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is that card's mana value. And you have seen so far that we have some big instant and sorcery spells floating around the 99 of this build. Whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player this turn, we copy the exiled card. We may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Imagine the synergies with all of the instant and sorcery spells that you've already seen in this deck tech, and we have Surge to Victory in our hand, or maybe Surge to Victory is in our graveyard that Magar decides to turn into a 3/3 creature. Boy, oh boy, we are really going to have a lot of fun with this card, particularly if we have the Berserker's Onslaught, which will allow Surge to Victory to be an extraordinarily dangerous card as a 3/3 creature with Magar. It's not going to do much outside of being able to hit for first strike damage first, but if we're able to cast this spell from our hand, it can also be considered a win condition. Either way, Surge to Victory in the easier scenario of being cast from our hand could be one of those cards that closes out the game and gives us the W. The following cards here in this section of the video are going to help us to inflate our spot removal and disruption. The first is going to be Feed the Swarm. 1 and a black at sorcery speed. We destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls. We will lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. The creature removal is nice, but this card is in here more for its enchantment removal. Rakdos does not deal with enchantments very well, but Feed the Swarm will. Next, we have the pleasure of adding 1 copy of Rakdos Charm, one of, if not the most powerfully relevant charms in the EDH format. 1 black, 1 red mana, we pick one of the following 3 modes. We either exile a graveyard, we destroy an artifact, or we have each creature deal 1 damage to its controller. Either way, all of those modes are extraordinarily relevant in our format, and Rakdos Charm is going to be very, very good if we can make it a 3/3 creature with Magar's activated ability. Our next removal spell is a straight-up Terminate. Instant speed, we get to destroy target creature, and it can't be regenerated. That's it. It's over. It's done with. It's heading right to the graveyard. Our next removal spell is Bedevil. 2 black and 1 red instant speed. We destroy target artifact, target creature, or target planeswalker. Chaos Warp follows. 2 and 1 red mana. This is one of those spells that could allow us to target those enchantments, which are very, very pesky against Rakdos decks. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, and then they reveal the top card of their library. If it's a permanent, they put it onto the battlefield. Everyone has a Chaos Warp story. Let me know yours in the comments section below. Kolaghan's Command follows. An instant for 1 in Rakdos colors, we get to pick 2 of the following 4 modes. We return target creature card from our graveyard to our hand, a mode that most likely will be one of the least utilized because of the low number of creatures in this deck. Target player discards a card, which is definitely Disruption. We get to destroy target artifact, or Kolaghan's Command deals 2 damage to target creature or player. Imagine this being one of the 3/3 face-down creatures activated from Magar, and each time it swings in for successful combat damage to an opponent, we get to pick 2 of those modes. I don't know about you, but destroying artifacts and having opponents discard cards seems like a very good formula for an eventual win. Our next removal spell is Hurl Through Hell. Instant speed for 2 in Rakdos colors, we exile target creature, and we may cast that card until the end of our next turn, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. So there's a lot to unravel here. Just being able to straight exile a creature could be extraordinarily powerful if we're looking at any kind of indestructible creatures stomping around the battlefield. But giving us until the end of our next turn turn to then cast that creature and put it on our side of the battlefield makes Hurl Through Hell a very, very versatile removal and advantage spell that we could include as one of the 3/3 face down creatures that we could put onto our side of the battlefield with an activation of Magar's ability. And the last removal spell for this section of the video is Price of Fame. It's an instant for 3 and a black mana, 3 and 1 black mana. It costs 2 generic mana less to cast if it targets a legendary creature, and then we get to destroy target creature. So if we're looking at a commander, or if we're looking at any legendary creature, we can just pay 1 and 1 black mana to destroy that creature. If it's not legendary, we're paying 3 and a black mana. But we also get to Surveil too. And in this deck, Surveil could be a very, very sneaky good way to get instant and sorcery spells into our graveyard from Magar. If you're unfamiliar with Surveil back during the Ravnica Allegiance Guilds to Ravnica block, we get to look at the top 2 cards of our library and put any number of them into our graveyard and the rest on the top of our library in any order. So if those 2 cards are 2 spicy instants and or sorcery spells that would be great targets from Magar, we're going to put those bad boys right into the graveyard, and all from just destroying a target creature. And again, similar to Hurl Through Hell, Price of Fame could be one of those great sneaky 3/3 creatures created by Magar that will help us to continue to fill the graveyard and pop off any creature on the battlefield because we don't have to worry about paying its mana cost. And as we reach the last section of this video, bringing this deck tech to a close, we're going to reveal the mana rocks and land base for this Magar of the Magic Strings Rakdos deck. We begin with Mana Crypt. It costs nothing to cast, but it may cost some life to keep it on the battlefield. And if your coin flipping skills are like mine, you're going to be lightning bolting yourself an awful lot. Next up, probably the best artifact in our format, Soul Ring. It's going to be in there because it's going to help to get our Magar creatures onto the battlefield much more quickly than just tapping 1 land to do so. Arcane Signet is going to give us a black or a red mana. It'll help to fix the color of our spells, plus it will help to ramp out those creatures even more quickly with Magar on our side of the battlefield. Talisman of Indulgence is our Rakdos Talisman. It's going to cost us 2 to cast, turn it sideways for 1 colorless mana, or we can choose to have 1 black or red mana added to our mana pool, and all that will cost is 1 damage to us. Rakdos Signet is going to cost 2 to cast, 1 generic mana to activate it, but we get a black and a red mana in its place. And the last mana rock in this deck is a Felwar Stone. Now, I don't know how popular red is in your metagame, but it's awfully popular in mine, and black is already a very powerful color to put in any EDH deck. We can almost look at Felwar Stone as Arcane Signet version 2.0. Minimally, we're looking at an artifact that can give us some additional mana to help power out Magar and any of the spells we need in order to win the game. Those are our 6 mana rocks, and now we're going to get to the lands in this deck. So we're playing 2 colors, so we're going to split this down black-red pretty evenly. We're going to begin with our basic lands, and we're going to start with our swamps, and we have 11 basic swamps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 basic swamps to start off the land base. And of course, if you're a fan of MTG Burgeoning, you know that symmetry is pretty important, particularly in 2-color decks. So to go along with the 11 basic swamps, we have 11 basic mountains. There they are, 10, 11. So 11 basic swamps, 11 basic mountains to bring our land count up to 22. And we're going to fill the rest of the land base with some non-basic lands. And a massive chunk of them are going to be lands that are going to provide either black or red or a choice when they ETB. We're going to begin with the best land in our format. It is Command Tower. It's going to tap for a black or it's going to tap for a red. Either way, we're so lucky to have this land in our format. Reflecting Pool under almost every circumstance possible is going to act as Command Tower number 2. It's going to tap for a mana of any mana that any of our lands can produce. All right, next up, we're going to run through all of our different Rakdos lands, starting with Blood Crypt. It comes into play tapped unless we pay 2 lands, gives us a black or a red. That is our Rakdos Shock land. Dragon Skull Summit is our Rakdos Check land. It'll come into play untapped most likely, as long as we have a swamp or mountain on our side of the battlefield. As long as we have more than one opponent, Luxury Suite will come into play untapped. That's our Rakdos Fan land. Our Rakdos Filter land is Graven Cairns. It turns sideways for a colorless mana, or we can pay a red or black, tap it to give it back 2 black, 2 red, or 1 of each color. Next up is our Rakdos Pain land, that's Sulphurous Springs. It'll tap for 1 colorless mana, or a black or a red, and if we choose the colored mana, we take 1 point of damage. Tainted Peak will give us 1 colorless mana always, but as long as we have a swamp on our side of the battlefield, we can tap it to add a black or red mana to our mana pool instead. Smoldering Marsh is our Rakdos Battle land from Battle from Zendikar. It'll come into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands. And with 22 basic lands in the deck, it seems very likely that Smoldering Marsh will come into play untapped, which will allow us to tap for a black or a red mana. Shadowblood Ridge is another one of our filter lands. We pay 1 generic mana into it, turn it sideways, and it'll give us a black and a red mana. That is our Rakdos Signet in land form. Next up is Blightstep Pathway, and on the other side is the red pathway. So we have to make the choice when it comes into play. Either we're going to keep it on the black side, or we're going to keep it on the red side. When we make that choice, it sticks. This is one of the few non-basic lands that will not provide 1 mana of either color. It's one or the other, and we make the choice when we play the land. And the last mana that's going to provide us the colors that we need is Foreboding Ruins. It'll come into play tapped unless we reveal a swamp or a mountain card. And when we do, either we do or we don't, either way, it's going to give us a black or a red mana. So there we have, was that 6, that's going to be 12, that's 1 dozen non-basic lands that are going to help to fix the mana to go on top of our 22 basics. So that's 34 lands, and we're left with 2 more lands, and the last 2 of this video, it is Access Tunnel. It's going to tap for a colorless mana, but more importantly, we can pay 3, and target creature with power 3 or less can't be blocked this turn. And yes, those creatures that Magar creates, those face-down instant and sorcery creatures, well, those are 3/3s. So with 3 mana and tapping Access Tunnel, we're going to make one of those 3/3s unblockable, which hopefully will guarantee that we can create the copy of that card and then cast it without paying its mana cost. And for 1 mana more, we can do the same thing with Rogue's Passage. It gives us a colorless mana, but we can pay for tap it, and target creature can't be blocked this turn. And there you have it. The land base is complete. The 99 has been sculpted around Magar of the Magic Strings. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, suggestions, and recommendations about this build in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.